I feel a campaign or messaging focused at that group which has the privilege to make a choice and to influence what choice they make will change the game.
Hello and welcome to the season 2 of Understanding the Future. I'm your host Punit Gandhi, and Climate Center for Cities is excited to bring to you a podcast about the future of work in the field of climate change, urban development, sustainability, and innovation. We will talk to experts working on ground as well as in the top management of government and non-governmental organizations to better understand how the field looks like in future. This will help us in preparing to enable climate actions as well as gauge the type of skill sets and jobs that would be required in future to solve complex challenges. If you are listening to it for the first time, do tune into season 1. Hello and welcome to the season 2 of Understanding the Future. I am your host Punit Gandhi, and today we have with us Aarti Khosla. She is the founder and director at Carbon Copy. She is also director at Climate Trends. She has been communicating climate for over a decade now, and she will help us in understanding this. Welcome to the show, Aarti.
Thanks, Puneet. Thank you for having me here.
So let's start with the basic question on about communicating climate. That is, how has the narrative of climate changed over years, especially with you being involved in it over a decade? How have you seen it evolve, and where is it right now?
Right. There are several ways to slice the pie, and let me start with one. Pretty much a decade ago, and even more than that, the discussion on climate issues was largely in the print media. And a lot of the policy discussions were focused on what is happening to the big discussions, the international negotiation process, and the links with all of that. 2015, as you know, was the Paris Agreement, and not only was it historic, it was pretty monumental. And if you analyze the last 5 or 10 years of coverage, specifically on climate science, climate policy, I think 2015 will stand out as a year in which there was a very significant spike in the coverage. My personal assessment is that before that time, the coverage of climate issues was largely focused on a certain part of the year when a lot of the journalists who will write about climate as a technical slash policy subject will focus on it more as an international process. But
Yeah.
having said that, I also have realized that a lot of the reporting of climate change in India essentially takes place in English and Hindi. Not surprising, most of our elite publications are in English, and climate is such a discussion that it hasn't been mainstreamed so much. So, to that extent, the English papers have invested quite some time and resource, at least for the last decade or so, to write about the issue. Hindi coverage itself is also there, but more in the sense of covering climate disasters or extreme weather events as an after effect, and not just in terms of, uh, rarely linking, so to say, to the broader issue of climate science and climate change. So that remains a gap. The one thing that I do want to point out to your specific question on how the narrative has changed is the role of social media. And, clearly, as we see these days, if you would do a survey for a city like Delhi or Mumbai, my sense is that you will have about 30 to 35% of the population for which social media is the first point of news consumption, or online at least is the first point of news consumption. And
Yeah.
clearly, for that quarter of the population, the narrative has differently evolved in terms of how people see air quality issues, how people see issues of urban mobility. We saw in the last year, in the phases of lockdown, there was greater awareness of cleaner cities,
Yeah.
better air quality, and people being able to willing to take action to step up if that is what brings clean air to them. So certainly, climate change is a concept which can be broken down in many ways, especially, and I will only end this answer by saying that the role of media on covering climate issues is fairly significant. Last couple of years, that role has been steady and continuous. So it does not feel that while the increase has not been enormous, at the same time, there has been just a continuous share of some of the key reporters who are writing on climate issues, but are also reporting on climate with respect to implications, solutions on key policies. For example, the transition that is happening with renewable energy coming, the transition that is happening with battery storage, the moving away from coal, and all of these are very key matters in terms of the larger policy decision. And a lot of this is being covered, and a lot of opinion is actually happening, not just by climate scientists, but also by industry leaders, sometimes by members of parliament, and sometimes even by local politicians. So all in all, the narrative on climate over the last 10 years has certainly widened and broadened, and the coverage itself has several touch points as opposed to the few touch points that it had a decade ago.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I did pick up a couple of points while you were speaking. There is a point about policy development, which it started. There is a point about awareness in people. There is a point about somewhere on the lines of involving more and more politicians as well on these lines. While all these things are separate things and they require different kinds of communication channels, how do you think that these kind of communication channels can be integrated for some kind of unison in voice or something?
Right, and let me explain this with an example of the public campaign on air quality in Delhi. That
Okay.
has been around for 5 years, and we have all been witness to it, sometimes even as Delhiites. And the
Yeah.
nature of the campaign started by being a very high decibel campaign in the winter months when the air pollution was at its peak. It also started with a lot of judicial activism, where judiciary was
Yeah.
able to intervene and ask for some decisions and make some asks in terms of just making sure that whatever can be done to mitigate Delhi's pollution, even little bit, is done.
Yeah.
Media as well played a very crucial role all through, and I remember it already in 2015. I think Indian Express had a series on air pollution called Death by Breath, and they put
Okay.
out some very impactful numbers about 5 or 6 years ago already on how much is the impact on public health. And ever since, of course, you have the WHOs, you have the Lancet, but you also have
Yeah.
the Indian research. For example, you have the Public Health Foundation of India and many others. So on the policy side, the evidence kept getting stronger.
Yeah.
On the judicial side, the push kept getting stronger in terms of compliance. On the
Yeah.
media side, the watchdog status kept getting stronger in terms of always shining a light on how much is the air quality, what are the data looking like. On the civil society side as well, the campaign became very strong, with a lot of organizations who were conventionally not working on air quality really seeing this as some kind of a prism through which they can enter and talk about air quality, but they can also address several other issues and solutions on the power sector reforms that are needed, the compliance of thermal power plants that's needed, even how transport and mobility issues, cycling and pedestrianization, looking at better parking policies. And it just opened up a lot of room to engage, even waste management, which
Yeah.
for a city like Delhi, is an enormous day-to-day problem. And let's always not just talk about the bigger issues to mitigate, but also issues like tackling construction waste and tackling dust and tackling waste, and all of these issues really found home in the air quality campaign. And to your question on where is that unison, I think the unison really is in the ability of the movement to create that window of opportunity where all these factors and all these pushes
Yeah.
align with each other in a certain way that the outcome is more than the sum of parts. And which is why I'm not commenting on the scale of action that has been taken by the government on air quality, but certainly there is a lot of recognition by all quarters of the government that air quality is a problem which cannot be denied, and there needs to be action as well. And that is just one example, but even otherwise, theoretically speaking, unless you
Yeah.
don't have certain constituencies across the spectrum to be able to believe and be convinced about the problem, you will not have that constituency which can demand change. In
Yeah.
case of Delhi, you had even the citizens of Delhi coming out and protesting. You had mothers for clean air asking for clean air. You had doctors, some of the most credible ones, lung surgeons, and even
Yeah.
others who were talking about the impact. So it is quite a strange mix of credibility, impact, academic rigor, which really has to come together to create that unison, at least in the Indian context, to be able to make a dent on what climate change communication can effectively be about.
No, it's absolutely true, and it's this kind of thing that kind of concerns me as well. That it's the climate change as a word is quite small, but it encompasses a lot of different topics. As you just pointed out with air quality, that with the conversation of air quality, we got in power sector, vehicle sector, transportation to a certain extent, then healthy lifestyle in general. So there are multiple facets to each solution as well as each problem in climate change. And my feeling over here again goes to that while we cater to each of these problems and we try to solve them or we try to address them, the narrative gets lost that okay, currently as soon as winter comes, Delhi goes towards air pollution. As soon as summer comes, it goes towards heat islands and heat waves and things like that. So the narrative keeps on changing while it all falls under the climate change perspective. How can that be streamlined in a way that while each problem has its own specific things to be described about, it still conveys the same message to the public?
Right. Well, first of all, to the extent that the narrative is driven by media, it's important to understand that the news cycle itself has a certain life. And at least in the last 10 years, we have seen that the life of the news cycle has become quite shortened. And which
Yeah.
also means that the deadline is for a day, even sometimes an hour. The way, TV and broadcast news has overtaken all other forms of reportage in some cases. The focus is a lot on, covering issues that have a shorter shelf life, greater public attention, easy to grab attention of the masses. Climate is anyway not that issue. It's extremely complex. It's a threat
Yeah.
multiplier. It's not that the urban conglomerates as well as the rural parts of India are only affected by climate change. They have
Yeah.
already been affected by several other issues that take precedence, whether it's poverty or livelihoods or public health or education, and all of these issues have taken precedence and they still do. So just putting climate in the front and center, I really don't think is the need. However, the need is to be able to connect the dots of the impact that the changing climate will have on all of these issues. And even that is not happening. The reason why that is not happening is certainly because this is 2 or 3 levels of communication. As much as you keep it simple, the message, you're not able to explain climate as a way to connect other issues. To connect the dots, you need time to develop that story. You need time to be able to write and present that story. And sometimes it feels that our news cycle is not being able to offer that time. So that, I think, is part of the problem, to your question, really, on how to be able to sustain the narrative. But the other part of your question, that the discussion is sometimes about drought or flood or heat wave or air pollution. To that extent, I think it is also fine, because it is not important to just double down on the phrase climate change. It's also
Yeah.
important to explain the lived experience of climate change. And in an Indian context, definitely the lived experience is much stronger. Whether or not people understand that climate change is impacting them, quite unlike an American audience or an
Yeah.
American citizen, a lot of people in India have an extreme lived experience of climate change. People living in rural areas have suffered crop losses, they have suffered due to erratic monsoons, the agriculture produce gets impacted. Those are direct impacts of climate change. If the issues that communities are facing living close to thermal power plants, and thermal power plants are not complying to emission standards. And a lot of the solutions oriented debate on climate is about looking at retirement or phasing down of thermal power plants so that the future replacement of energy demand can happen through renewable energy sources. These are directly linked as solutions of climate change, but cannot be presented as such. And in the
Yeah.
Indian context, where there will always be a dozen other items to also discuss in the news media, it's very hard to make sure that one narrative connects the dot. I feel that is ambitious to an extent, but what is possible really is to maintain a continuous drumbeat of the impacts as well as the solutions, and do it for each of the separate audience in a different way. And
Yeah.
it's not necessary to break down the audience too much, but at least break it down to the extent of what's relevant to the policymakers probably is different from what is relevant to the public. And it's quite different as compared to what is relevant for a politician to listen to. And I think
Yeah.
just breaking down the message in a way how it makes sense to a political leader to nudge him to action, but at the
Yeah.
same time how it creates enough awareness in the public to be able to push for some action. These are the kind of things which I think some, like the campaigners like us, should really be thinking more about on where to place that lever, so that
Yeah.
what you get is some change in public behavior or some change in decision makers attitude. Those are not easy things, but some of it has happened in the last couple of years, and that is the direction to go in, I feel.
No, I absolutely agree because this is a continuous effort, and as you had previously pointed out as well, that in major cities, major consumption of news is via social media. So that is where I think one other thing that comes up on those lines is because it's through social media, it gets overwhelming after a point because the algorithms are also such that you keep on seeing the same news again and again in different formats. And it's not just one news and then all different kinds of news comes into picture. Can this kind of news cycles be created in a more action oriented way, where instead of just while we are saying that okay, this is the challenge, how it can be solved is also included. Again, this is a very broad question, I know, but somewhere on those lines, can we create some communications on those lines which is more action oriented?
Certainly, I think we need to create communications that is action oriented, because on certain issues there is a high degree of awareness. So
Yeah.
the next step indeed is action. And the question really to answer is, how do I know that what I need to do when I fully am aware that there is a problem that exists?
Yeah.
And several surveys have been done. Again, I will take the case of Delhi and air pollution,
Yeah.
but to a regular English, or let's say like that, for a Delhiite where English is either the first language or the second language, I think at least over 99% of people are aware about air pollution. That's not a small
Yeah.
percentage, but very few people are taking some action. Similarly, if you will take the case of a rural community in Chhattisgarh, a lot
Mhm.
of people will be aware about the problems that they are having on the health impacts by staying close to a thermal power plant. But what are they able to do about it? That difference is quite enormous. And
Yeah.
really, the point of developing communications is to reduce that distance. And what I think is, I mean, of course, in the Indian context, again, it's not very unidirectional and easy. But theoretically speaking, I think we also need to just have messages which resonate and they are convincing and not just coercing people to action,
Yeah.
because that doesn't work in a public movement where people are forced to act, and that will only have its impact for an extremely short term. But one other thing is also that as people feel that the psychological distance between them and the problem at hand has reduced, people will
Yeah.
eventually stand up and act. So if trees are being cleared from a forest patch to create a metro shed in Mumbai, then Mumbaikars stood up and spoke about it. And there are several examples across the country on how local campaigns have built up. In Tamil Nadu, recently against the port expansion, couple of years back, the Sterlite campaign, and all of that has gathered quite a bit of momentum. So really, Climate change is not an exotic concept for Indians. It's a matter of survival. It's a matter of, just being able to pull through their anyway hard existence. And when that gets tempered with a little bit, then I think with or without climate action or a climate campaign, there is a groundswell of movement that builds up. For us, we really need to see where is that point where people are not pushed to an extreme condition that their psychological distance between them and the problem becomes a question of survival on an
Okay.
hourly basis, because that itself feels that you're extremely living on the edge, and a lot of communities in India are indeed living on the edge, but just among the middle of the pyramid, that broad middle class or whoever you call them, I think there is a lot of population, whether it is the youth, whether it's a well-informed citizen in a city who is able to stand up for a cause, or can create at least a constituency which can demand change. I think that group needs to be engaged a little bit. It's not always good to rest on the shoulders of the most marginalized to raise their voice, because it really impacts their existence, and there is no no other way for them than to raise their voice, because it's a question of their survival. And I think just making sure that the middle also rises to the occasion a little bit as and when needed is
Yeah.
something which can help advance the thinking and action on environmentalism in India, which anyway we have a long history of, but it has taken various shapes and forms from the Chipko movement to the Chamoli disaster, and we've all been reading about all of that as well.
Yeah, I agree. In the next phase, I want to go towards a more granular aspect of behavior change on these lines as well, because I feel it's very important when we are communicating, and especially when we are doing such long stretched continuous communication. How does behavior change come into picture, and how one of the examples or at least one of the thoughts I have on these lines is that now most of the government campaigns as well that go, so let's take for example Swachh Bharat Mission. As a part of the assessment of in Swachh Sarvekshan, each city was or each state was told to give a song to it, which brought in the local context to it. And that made it okay that whenever you hear it, you know that the van is coming and you can bring that, take your garbage out. So that kind of behavior changes are very important. How do you think, or can we bring more of such campaigns on those lines, either government, private, however it is, but to make such kind of changes?
For sure. First of all, in a public campaign, I think the Indian discussion on climate change, at least, has come to a point where it's one issue or another in one part of the country or another.
Yeah,
Either you are looking at incessant rains in Mumbai, or there is water
yeah,
scarcity in Chennai, or there will be flash floods in Uttarakhand. There will be, incidentally, some of the eight of the top 10 polluted cities in some ranking were all from Uttar Pradesh. So
yeah,
people are not aware of this level of climate impact that they're already facing. So one way to engage the public is certainly, your point of just placing the lever in such a way that there is a certain change in behavior. The only issue I feel is that campaigners sometimes haven't been able to crack adequately on where to place that lever so that that change in behavior happens, because that is the first absolute essential step. And it's not just change in behavior, it's also a change in thinking, and change in your belief, which will bring about the change. And it's not always about the public only. Sometimes we even need change in decision makers' thought process to be able to conceive a particular idea, because there is a problem. And climate change is actually a classic example of that, because as a science, it is new and evolving. As a concept, it is still being discussed. Even today, if you follow some of the international and even national commentary and discussions, there is a very alive and wild discussion, so to say, on how countries should take economy wide emission reduction targets and do deep decarbonization and become net zero by mid century or thereabouts. Now, the
Yeah.
phrase net zero is really technical. It's
Yeah.
what it means is that, there is less emissions added than emissions removed, and
Yeah.
also means that emissions have to be reduced, not just removed. First, they have to be reduced. And these are the kind of conversations where, at the moment at least, the public does not have a role to play that much as it has to be a role of the policymakers and decision makers. And unless they are not convinced that this is needed and this is possible, and the later we do it, the greater will be the cost of doing it, I think this whole idea does not work. And which is why I said the thought process is always not just with the public, it's also the thought process of the political leaders as well as the thought process of the decision makers. And to some extent, it feels that, that also needs to be given a more composite and a connected view. Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change is responsible for climate action and
Yeah.
is the nodal ministry for it. Ministry of Power has a role to play, but certainly, and a lot of climate experts have talked about it, that let climate not sit in one or two ministries, let it
Yeah.
really intersect with everything, because climate change and its impact intersects with industry, it intersects with women and child health, it intersects just with public health. And unless all these key departments are not involved and the thought process
Yeah.
is not one of connecting, it will be very hard to take a stance which really is in the benefit in the long run. So that's, on the side of how it's important to make the change in behavior and thinking in terms of key influencers and decision makers. But sometimes just credible people coming and saying something has a far greater impact on the public even than a government campaign. And we saw this at the in the air pollution campaign, at least, how doctors stood up and said that the air pollution in Delhi is really bad and it's a case of emergency, and if
Yeah.
people have an option, should not be staying in the city. That was a really harsh statement. To me, it was also an alarmist statement, because if I don't have a second home, where do I go? But it
Yeah.
creates that panic sometimes, and sometimes that panic is needed as well to be able to drive home the point. So it's really about figuring what kind of message is needed to which kind of an audience, and then figuring out what is it that we can attain in terms of behavior change. I mean, government has a lot of campaigns and schemes, and now we are talking about climate issues, but even 20, 30 years back, for instance, PCRA and used to run the campaigns, where they used to ask cars to shut off their
Yeah.
engines at traffic lights and not put the vehicle in idle mode. Then certainly, for example, the Bureau of Energy Efficiency Star Rating campaign is a very good example on how, just in a couple of years, the whole concept of watching whether the appliance that you're buying is 3 rated or 5-star rated, and consumers
Yeah.
actually do that. Even the LED program, I mean, it became a fancy thing. You
Yeah.
get a well lit room in 2 watts, and how the technology also changed in it, and consumers got driven to it. So it just feels like a lot of things have to go hand in hand, because people are also waiting for some solutions. And if there are breakthrough technologies that are available at an affordable cost for Indians, even that matters, and for everybody, the price point at which I buy something. And
Yeah.
to that extent, if there is a way which is cost effective but which also helps me do my bit for the environment, I will go ahead and do it immediately. But if it is not cost effective and it's only good for the environment, for example, buying an electric vehicle today, buying an electric car today, a lot of people have hesitation. And we undertook a
Yeah.
survey a couple of weeks back, and which actually gave very good revealing results that most of the electric car owners
Hmm.
who are running and who own an electric car say that they will definitely recommend it to others to buy an electric car. They also said that they don't have any problem in charging. They also said that they have so far never experienced range anxiety while they are driving. So
Yeah.
these are all myths around electric vehicles, because of which I or others will not buy an electric car yet. But if
Yeah.
you talk to actual users, then the situation is really different. And I think sometimes even changing behavior is by listening to peers. If I know
Yeah.
that 200 of the new car buyers in Delhi are willing to look at buying an EV, then it really builds my confidence that that is going to be the future and maybe not a bad idea to also be a pioneer. So I think the shift in people's mind is also really gradual and not sometimes radical, and we need to capture the momentum around it.
Yeah. No, no, I absolutely agree with your peers thing because for me, I have seen it personally as well. So I have been working somewhere close to climate change for last 5, 6 years. Have studied somewhere on those lines for 2, 3 years. But my parents never understood the same until Greta Thunberg came in and my sister started supporting the whole thing. It's then my family started realizing, okay, he's doing something related to this. Till that time they supported it because okay, they were like, he knows what he's doing. But that peer-to-peer learning is something I think affects a lot of conversations. So coming to,
Yeah, and
yeah, sorry, go
in
ahead.
an Indian context, it's quite different. And, when we interact with similar colleagues across the world, it does feel that climate as an understanding and an issue is far deeply entrenched in the society than ours. And at this point, you and I have both discussed it, and no need to labor on that point anymore. But definitely, this is an evolving field, and it just feels that 5 or 10 years down, there will be a far greater recognition of what the subject really brings and the intersections that it lends, which I don't think any other subject really offers. I mean, being a climate expert, ideally you should be able to, like, you can draw the connections, like I said before, with movement building, with campaigns, with journalism, with communications, with expert technical research capacity on things like transport, mobility, industry, business sector, finance,
Yeah,
renewables, and to that extent, it really, I think, is an issue which has quite amalgamated the scale of the problem, and shown you how there are several spokes to take action. It's not just that there will be one silver bullet to deal with the climate
yes,
solution. There will be 24 things to be done, and even then not sufficient, and which is why the issue seems so enormous and existential, and which
yeah.
is why I think sometimes there is greater need to collaborate, but less of that is happening.
True. No, I absolutely agree as well on those lines as well, especially on the collaboration part. That this is not a battle to be, go in individually, but you have to go in this together. Unless till you do that, you're not going to sustain the momentum. Coming on those lines, so there is surely a lot of, as you have already pointed it out, that internationally there are different conversations going. Indian context, there are different conversations going, and they do have to match so that India leads in the same fashion that every other country is leading. India, while trying to again, India is still a developing country. We are still trying to control the rate of increase of your consumption, energy consumption, equipment consumption, and everything. Because I feel here as well, somewhere communications will be a major thing that will come in to make sure that the link between consumption and utilization of or resource efficiency comes in. So, where do you see this international and Indian linkages facilitating the other way around as well? That whatever has been learned from India goes abroad and is a new learning for them.
It's an interesting question. I think the answer really is not that simple. It's okay to wish for our legacy behavior of just having sustainability, recycling. We've always lived by these
Yeah,
principles. We don't just discard our clothes and throw them away. We hand them down to somebody so that they are of use somewhere. We don't throw up plastic bags too much. We try and recycle them a couple of
yeah,
times before. And there are 20, scores of other such examples. Anyway, the West is realizing these issues, and you see a lot of youngsters now pretty cognizant of of a day-to-day sustainable lifestyle, but certainly that's not how the West has lived in the last few decades. And the question on whether the learnings can happen from India to abroad anyway is not a shortcut. If that learning has to happen, then there has to be, I think, if it will happen, it will happen over a period of time, and then it's not just about India taking those learnings, but it's about the global recognition of the right way of consumption.
Yeah,
And the issue is that as much as we separate ourselves from the aspirations of the white Western world as the real aspirations of human existence, the better off we will be. Of course, we need to grow, and there are several studies which already show that half of the buildings which will exist in 2035 in India haven't even been built. So,
yeah,
if those are the amount of buildings, commercial, residential, that will be built in the next 10 or 15 years, then they better be built in a way that they are energy efficient, they are cooling
yeah,
efficient, they don't need the kind of air conditioning that will be needed in a typical building constructed in the West about 40 years back. And I think
yeah,
that is what climate experts call the whole question of leapfrog, that you skip
yeah,
one middle step and you leapfrog into a better thing. But the question is, to be able to leapfrog into a better thing, you need that better thing. You need that better technology,
yeah,
and you need that better technology at an affordable cost. And clearly, it feels that every time India takes pride in saying that its 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 problems are unique and its solutions are unique as well. And I really feel that it's my hope that the fact that we are different than America and China, for example. They are both on two sides of the spectrum, even in terms of the political economy. India has some immense soft power which it can build up, and that really feels that should be the point to put the accelerator on and ramp up a little bit. And any campaign or effort which is directed to developing the thinking of the vast expanding urban middle class on what consumption is and what is good consumption and aspiration as well, I think will go in the right direction. And it just, for example, even the last 1 year of staying at home and just the mental situation that has been brought by the COVID virus, a lot of
yeah,
people have realized that what has happened has been partly a result of human intransigence into nature. So you have realized that somewhere human beings have a role to play in how the species is literally overtaking the planet, and unless that is not stopped to a certain extent or held back in its tracks, we will come to a point of no return where we are like we will overshoot, and we are overshooting. The
yeah,
World Overshoot Day is, already in August and September, which basically means that for a year's resource, we have used it by August and September.
yeah,
So clearly, all these things are important from the smallest to the biggest. But my personal feeling is that a lot of Indians in their day to day, without even knowing, sometimes, and of course, we don't have the means to really be able to consume at that level. We don't have that much, even we don't have that much power supply to enjoy. Let's just say India is we've announced that we are 100% energy access, but the number of hours the power will
yeah,
come in a remote village in Uttar Pradesh and is anybody's guess. So all of these issues are not unidirectional, they are fairly complicated, but certainly there is there is a bottom of the pyramid which does not have an option, and they have to consume the resource that is given to them. I
yeah,
think the slightly above the bottom of the pyramid, who have the choice to be able to make the decision, I feel a campaign or messaging focused at that group which has the privilege to make a choice and to influence what choice they make will change the game.
I absolutely hope that we can do things on those lines to make a better change in India as well as internationally. And to close it off, we have generally the last question is what kind of skill sets would be required to pursue this field. I'll try and change it a bit for this episode. Is on the lines that we already have enough marketing and people in our ecosystem. How can they transition towards this kind of communications? How can they leverage their existing skill sets to develop better communications in the climate change sector?
You're right, absolutely, that there are enough skills out there. What we need is we need to be able to draw those skills to the subject, to make this subject important enough, urgent enough, and alarming enough for those who are qualified in whatever they do to find passion in the subject. And I think that is what we need. We need more journalists, we need more PR persons, we need more documentary filmmakers, we need more social media experts, we need more campaigners. We just need more citizens to be able to stand up and acknowledge that this is happening and I'm aware of this and I am determined to change this. And that doesn't have to be always at the level of the nation state. It can also be at the level of my resident society or my community or my city or somebody's village. And I just feel that there is that power of these smaller you know movements,
Yeah,
so to speak, which always don't have to be antagonistic as well, and that's not the point. But the point really is to be able to come together to realize that this is an issue important enough for me to know and act on.
yeah,
Just that much is enough to also show politicians that people care, and that much is also enough for decision makers and policy makers to understand that this is becoming something which the public is willing to act on and has already acknowledged. And then we can move the needle on action much faster, as opposed to if the government has to take a decision only based on an international pressure, or an industry has to just reduce pollution as for the sake of complying to emission norms. I think just this whole question of compliance changes when there is a movement and passion behind something. And
yeah,
on skills, there are enough researchers working on climate. I think what we need is we need to build the field by some of those people who are not just technical, but
yeah,
also who have skills to reach out to various different constituencies. And that
yeah,
will connect the dots and maybe bring around a far greater spectrum of both experts as well as influencers, people who are working in, just like you said, various different fields, but be able to link to this existential problem of not just the future but today.
yeah. Thank you so much. This was surely an amazing conversation because I was looking forward for it for quite some time, especially this topic. If I have missed out on anything and you would like to cover it up, please go ahead.
Thanks. I enjoyed this as well. I really don't have much to opine, but I think in the context of India, and if there is a scope for a last point, maybe I will just drop the point that there is also the share of vernacular language media, and we didn't discuss about that pretty much, but
Yeah,
a lot of TV viewership as well as newspaper readership happens in the vernacular language. And certainly while we are having such discussions, we are absolutely sometimes not cognizant of the
yeah,
immense share of that population. It's nearly 50% of the country's population, and unless we don't bring that sector on board, that target audience along with us, I think
yeah,
again we will be creating another silo of
yeah,
the kind of which we are living in. So certainly I think there is a role to be played by as much localizing the climate discussion as possible. And it has to be something that is of immediate concern to local media, to local decision makers, to local communities for it to have its impact.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for bringing up that topic. I absolutely agree with you that yes, we do need to start emphasizing on vernacular languages in promoting and communicating climate change as well as a lot of other things in the whole ecosystem. But this as well becomes part of that whole system. Thank you, Aarti, for an amazing conversation. I absolutely enjoyed it, and I hope our audience did it too. Thank you for your time.
Thanks very much, Puneet. Thank you very much.
You have been listening to Understanding the Future podcast. To know more about Climate Center for Cities, check out our website www.niua.org/c-q. The show is conceptualized, produced, and edited by Punit Gandhi, Senior Associate at CQ. You can now subscribe to our podcast on your favorite channel, which can be accessed through the credits. Also, don't forget to follow us on our social media for more updates. Do share your reviews with us and help us spread the podcast to your friends and colleagues. Do write to us if you would be interested in learning about any specific topics. Thank you and stay tuned for our next episode.